Clara Jennings sits in her kitchen, sunlight streaming through lace curtains as she holds a faded photograph. The image shows a 7-year-old girl with pigtails kneeling beside a scraggly donkey, 5 crumpled dollar bills clutched in her small fist. That was 65 years ago, when young Clara spent her entire birthday savings to rescue a donkey everyone else had given up on. What the photograph doesn't show is what happened next. How that same donkey appeared in the woods 3 months later when Clara was lost and afraid, leading her safely home through paths it shouldn't have known. How it seemed to understand her tears and fears in ways that defied explanation. Now, decades later, Clara discovers she wasn't the only one. A trail of quiet miracles stretches across the years, all connected to one extraordinary animal. But what was it about this donkey that touched so many lives in ways no one could explain? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The afternoon light filters through Clara Jennings' kitchen window, casting long shadows across the worn oak table where she sits with a cup of tea growing cold. At 72, Clara moves with the deliberate care of someone who has spent decades tending to others first as a registered nurse for 43 years, now simply as a woman trying to make sense of the quiet years that stretch ahead. Her cottage sits at the edge of Millbrook, the same small Iowa town where she was born, where she learned to walk on these same sidewalks, where she eventually returned after retirement 6 years ago. The house itself holds layers of memory, like sediment in an old riverbed. Her adoptive parents had lived here until their passing, and Clara found comfort in the familiar creak of floorboards, the way morning sun painted the living room walls. Golden, the view of distant fields from her bedroom window. On the kitchen counter sits a small wooden cross, hand-carved and smooth from years of handling. Dr. Margaret Patterson had given it to Clara on her last day at Mercy General Hospital in Des Moines. For someone who brought healing wherever she went, Margaret had said, pressing the cross into Clara's palm. Clara had carried it in her pocket through countless shifts, through the hardest cases, through the nights when families said goodbye to their loved ones. It represented something she couldn't quite name, not religion exactly, but purpose, the sacred act of tending to those who suffered. Now the cross sits beside her pill organizer and reading glasses, a reminder of the life she'd left behind. Some days Clara wondered if retiring had been a mistake. The quiet could be overwhelming after decades of hospital chaos, monitors beeping, families weeping, the constant hum of life and death decisions. Here in Millbrook, the loudest sound was usually Mrs. Henderson's television next door or the distant rumble of farm equipment during harvest season. Clara's neighbor, Doris Henderson, had been widowed 3 years longer than Clara had been alone. They developed an unspoken friendship built on borrowed sugar, shared newspapers, and the occasional evening spent on Clara's front porch watching the sun set over the cornfields. Doris possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of everyone who'd ever lived in Millbrook, their family histories stretching back generations. You know, Doris had said just last week while they shelled peas on the porch, I always wondered what happened to that little donkey you rescued at the county fair. Must have been 1959 or so. My Harold was still alive then. God rest his soul. The comment had caught Clara off guard. She'd rarely spoken of that day, not even to her late husband Robert. It felt too private somehow, too fragile to expose to casual conversation. But Doris's words had lodged in her mind like a splinter. And yesterday, while cleaning out a drawer, Clara had found the photograph. Now she studies it again, tracing the edges where time has softened the corners. The little girl in the picture herself looks determined despite her tears. The donkey beside her is thin, its coat dull and patchy, one ear drooping from what Clara now recognizes as an old injury. She remembers how it had trembled when she first approached, how gently it had taken the apple slices she offered, The county fair had been the highlight of summer for most children in Millbrook. Clara's adoptive parents, Harold and Ruth Jennings, had given her $5 for her 7th birthday, a small fortune in 1959, with instructions to spend it on something special, while other children gravitated toward cotton candy and carnival rides. Clara had wandered to the livestock area, where farmers displayed their animals for judging. She'd found the donkey in a pen by itself, away from the prized cattle and sheep. A hand-lettered sign read "Free to Good Home." The animal's owner, a gruff man with tobacco-stained teeth, had explained that the donkey was worthless for work due to a leg injury from years before. He was planning to have it put down if no one claimed it by the end of the fair. 7-year-old Clara had pressed her 5 birthday dollars into the man's palm and asked if she could take the donkey home. The transaction had required her parents' reluctant consent and the arrangement for the donkey to stay temporarily at the Whitman farm on the outskirts of town. Clara had visited every day for 2 weeks, bringing apples and carrots, sitting quietly beside the animal as it gradually gained weight and strength. Then one morning, the donkey was gone. Mr. Whitman had found the gate open. No signs of forced entry. The donkey had simply vanished, leaving behind only hoofprints that disappeared at the edge of the pasture. Clara had cried for days, certain she'd failed her first real responsibility. What she'd never told anyone was what happened 3 months later. She'd been walking home from school through the woods behind the elementary building, taking a shortcut she'd used dozens of times before. But that October afternoon, the familiar path seemed different. Shadows fell in strange patterns, and the trail she knew by heart appeared to fork in directions she'd never noticed. Clara had wandered deeper into the woods, growing more frightened as the daylight faded. Just as panic began to set in, she heard the soft sound of hooves on fallen leaves. The donkey emerged from between the trees, looking healthier than she'd ever seen it, coat glossy, eyes bright and alert. Without hesitation, it had approached her, nudging her gently with its nose before turning and walking deeper into the woods. Clara had followed, somehow understanding that she should trust this unexpected guide. The donkey led her along paths she'd never seen before, through clearings, dappled with the last golden light of day, until they emerged at the edge of the woods, just 2 blocks from her house. She turned to thank her rescuer, but the donkey had already disappeared back into the shadows between the trees. The memory had felt so dreamlike that Clara had eventually convinced herself it was imaginary, a child's fantasy born from grief over losing her beloved animal. But holding the photograph now, seeing the intelligence in those dark eyes, she wondered if she'd been too quick to dismiss what couldn't be easily explained. A knock at the door interrupts her reverie. Through the window, she sees Tom Bradley, standing on her front porch, a manila folder tucked under his arm. Tom serves as the unofficial town historian, a retired high school principal who's made it his mission to preserve Millbrook's past through meticulous record-keeping and an impressive collection of photographs, documents, and memorabilia. "Good afternoon, Clara," Tom says when she opens the door. His white beard and gentle eyes give him the appearance of a scholarly Santa Claus. "Doris Henderson mentioned you might be interested in some old county fair records. I've been digitizing the Historical Society's files, and I came across something that might interest you." Clara invites him in, offering coffee that he accepts gratefully. Tom spreads the contents of his folder across her kitchen table: photocopies of fair programs, newspaper clippings, and what appears to be an official receipt book from 1959. "Look at this," Tom says, pointing to an entry in faded blue ink. "August 15th, 1959. One donkey, sold to H. Jennings, guardian for minor child. $5. That would be your father, Harold, wouldn't it?" Clara nods, surprised to see their family name in such official documentation. The receipt makes the memory feel more real somehow, less like a child's fantasy. And here's the interesting part. Tom continues, flipping to a newspaper clipping dated several weeks later. The headline reads, "Missing Donkey Sparks Search." The brief article describes how a donkey had disappeared from the Whitman farm, with speculation about theft, or the animal wandering off in search of its previous owner. Mr. Whitman reported the disappearance to the sheriff, Tom explains, but there were no leads, no sightings. The donkey simply vanished without a trace. He pauses, studying Clara's face. Doris mentioned you might remember something about this animal. Clara finds herself sharing the story she's kept private for over 6 decades, the rescue, the brief time caring for the donkey, and even the mysterious encounter in the woods. Tom listens without interruption, occasionally making notes in a small leather journal. "You know," he says finally, "yours isn't the only story I've heard about an unusual donkey around that time. There have been others over the years, people mentioning encounters with an animal that seemed to appear when it was needed most." He gathers his papers carefully. "If you're truly interested in learning what became of your donkey, I might be able to help you trace its path." The Historical Society has connections with neighboring counties, and I've developed quite a network of fellow researchers. After Tom leaves, Clara sits at her kitchen table as evening shadows lengthen across the floor. She picks up the wooden cross from the counter, rolling it between her palms as she'd done countless times during difficult nights at the hospital. The smooth wood warms under her touch, and she feels something she hasn't experienced since retirement, a sense of purpose beginning to stir. The photograph lies before her, the little girl and the donkey frozen in time. But Clara realizes this isn't just about nostalgia or idle curiosity. Something about this story feels unfinished, as if there are questions she's meant to ask, connections she's supposed to discover. She retrieves a yellow legal pad from the kitchen drawer and begins making a list of people to contact, places to visit, questions that need answers. At the top of the page, she writes, "What happened to the donkey?" Beneath that, who else might remember? As she writes, Clara feels a familiar sensation, the same focused determination that had carried her through nursing school, through the long hours of caring for patients, through the hardest cases that required not just medical knowledge, but genuine compassion. It's the feeling of having work to do, of being useful again. Outside, the first stars appear in the darkening sky. Clara makes herself a simple dinner and settles into her father's old recliner with the photograph propped on the side table. She studies every detail, the donkey's patient expression, her own determined 7-year-old face, the county fair banner visible in the background. Tomorrow, she decides she'll begin looking for answers. Not because she expects to solve a mystery that's decades old, but because sometimes the most important journeys begin with a single step into the unknown. And sometimes, Clara thinks as she turns off the lamp and heads upstairs to bed, the stories we think we've forgotten are simply waiting for the right moment to be remembered. The wooden cross goes with her, tucked safely in her palm as she climbs the stairs. Behind her, the photograph remains on the kitchen table, catching the last light from the street lamp outside, a 7-year-old girl and a rescued donkey. The beginning of a story that Clara is only now ready to finish. The Millbrook Historical Society occupies a converted Victorian house on Maple Street, its rooms filled with the carefully preserved remnants of a century and a half of small-town life. Clara arrives Tuesday morning to find Tom Bradley already at work, surrounded by cardboard boxes and manila folders that overflow from every available surface. "I've been thinking about your donkey all weekend," Tom says, looking up from a ledger book. "And I believe I may have found our starting point." He gestures toward a chair beside his desk, which is spread with photocopied documents. "But I have to warn you, some of what I've discovered isn't particularly pleasant." Clara settles into the chair, her hands folded in her lap. 6 decades of nursing have taught her that difficult truths are often preferable to comforting lies. Tom opens a folder and withdraws a yellowed receipt, the paper so fragile it seems ready to crumble at a touch. This is from Baxter's Livestock Exchange in Cedar Rapids, dated July 1959, about 3 weeks before the county fair. It documents the sale of one donkey to Walt Morrison for $15. The name Walt Morrison sends an uncomfortable chill through Clara's memory. She'd known him only vaguely as a child, a man who appeared at local fairs with a small collection of animals, usually selling to farmers looking for inexpensive livestock. Morrison had a reputation, Tom continues carefully. Not a good one. The older farmers I've spoken with remember him as someone who dealt in damaged animals, creatures that had been injured or mistreated, then sold cheap to anyone who'd take them. Clara's throat tightens. You mean the donkey was hurt before? I found it? According to this veterinary report, Tom says, producing another document, the animal had sustained a severe leg injury, likely from being kicked by a horse or mule. The injury was never properly treated, which left the donkey with a permanent limp and made it unsuitable for heavy labor. Clara studies the vet's careful handwriting, the clinical description of wounds and healing complications. Between the lines, she can read the story of an animal that had suffered and been discarded because it could no longer serve its purpose. There's more, Tom says gently. He shows her a small news item from the Cedar Rapids Gazette. Local man charged with animal neglect. The brief article describes how Walt Morrison had been cited for keeping livestock in inadequate conditions, with several animals confiscated by county authorities. This was in June 1959, Tom explains. Just a month before he sold your donkey. My guess is that Morrison was liquidating his animals to avoid further legal trouble. Clara feels a familiar ache in her chest, the same sensation she'd experienced countless times in the hospital when learning about a patient's suffering. So when I found the donkey at the fair, you were looking at an animal that had been injured, neglected, and was likely destined for slaughter if no one took it. Tom's voice carries the weight of someone who spent years uncovering difficult histories. Your $5 didn't just buy a pet, Clara. You saved a life. The revelation transforms Clara's childhood memory. What she'd remembered as an impulsive act of compassion now reveals itself as something more significant, a rescue that had probably been the difference between life and death for the donkey. But where did it go after it disappeared from the Whitman farm? Clara asks. Tom opens another folder, this one containing what appears to be a collection of handwritten notes. This is where the trail becomes more interesting and, frankly, more mysterious. I've spent the weekend making phone calls to anyone I could think of who might remember that time period. He spread several pages across the desk. These are notes from conversations with people who recalled seeing or hearing about an unusual donkey in the years following. 1959. The stories are scattered across 3 counties and span nearly 2 decades. Clara leans forward to read the careful transcriptions. Mrs. Albert Hoffman, age 89. There was a donkey that used to appear at our farm during hard winters. Never knew where it came from, but it would stay just long enough to help our mules pull loads through deep snow, then disappear again. James Kowalski, retired mail carrier. I remember delivering mail to farms where people talked about a donkey that seemed to show up when animals were in distress. Never belonged to anyone in particular, but folks would leave hay out for it. Sister Mary Catherine, retired from St. Margaret's School. The children used to talk about a gentle donkey that would appear on the playground when someone was hurt or upset. We assumed it belonged to a neighboring farm, but when we asked around, no one claimed it. Clara reads through page after page of similar accounts. The details vary, but a consistent pattern emerges. A donkey that appeared during times of need, helped in whatever way it could, then vanished as mysteriously as it had arrived. Tom, Clara says slowly, these stories span decades. How could the same animal be involved in all of these incidents? That's what makes this so remarkable, Tom replies. Either we're looking at multiple donkeys with similar coloring and temperament, or, he pauses, clearly weighing his words carefully. Or what? Or we're documenting something that doesn't fit easily into conventional explanations. Tom's scholarly demeanor can't quite hide his excitement. Clara, I've been researching local history for 30 years. I've never encountered anything like this. So many independent witnesses describing what appears to be the same animal over such an extended period. Clara stands and moves to the window, looking out at the quiet street where she'd walked as a child. The rational part of her mind, the part trained in medical science and empirical observation, wants to dismiss these stories as folklore. The kind of tales that grow in the telling until they bear little resemblance to reality. But she can't forget the feeling of that October afternoon in the woods. The certainty she'd felt that the donkey had come looking for her specifically, had known exactly how to lead her home. There's one more thing, Tom says behind her. He's holding a different folder, this one marked with a red tab. I found this in the county clerk's records from 1960. Clara returns to her chair as Tom opens the folder to reveal a death certificate. The name at the top reads Walt Morrison. According to the document, Morrison had died in a farming accident in March 1960, just 7 months after selling the donkey to Clara. The interesting detail, Tom says, pointing to a section of the certificate, is the location where he was found. Morrison's body was discovered in a field about 2 miles from the Whitman farm, where your donkey had been staying. Clara studies the document, trying to understand its significance. What are you suggesting? I'm not suggesting anything specific, Tom replies carefully. But the timing is interesting. Morrison dies just months after your donkey disappears. And according to the sheriff's report, Morrison appeared to have been kicked by a large animal, possibly a horse or mule. The implications hang unspoken in the air between them. Clara finds herself remembering the veterinary report Tom had shown her earlier, the description of the donkey's injury caused by being kicked. She wonders if Walt Morrison had been the one who'd inflicted that wound. I think, Clara says finally, I need to visit some of the people on your list. I want to hear these stories firsthand. Tom nods, as if he'd been expecting this response. I've already made some preliminary contacts. Mrs. Hoffman lives in a care facility in Cedar Rapids now, but she's sharp as a tack and eager to talk. The retired teacher, Sister Mary Catherine, is still active at the convent, and there are others. Clara takes the folder of contact information, feeling the weight of responsibility that comes with pursuing truth. Tom, what if these stories lead somewhere I'm not prepared to go? What if the answers aren't what I expect? Tom Bradley has spent his career helping young people grapple with difficult questions. His response carries the wisdom of someone who's learned to trust the value of seeking truth, regardless of where it leads. Clara, you spent 43 years as a nurse. You've seen things that couldn't be easily explained, witnessed recoveries that defied medical predictions, sat with people during their final moments and felt the presence of something larger than what we can measure or quantify. He closes the folders carefully. If anyone is prepared to follow this story wherever it leads, it's you. As Clara drives home that afternoon, Tom's words echo in her mind. She thinks about the countless nights she'd worked in the hospital, the patients who'd recovered against all odds, the families who'd found peace in circumstances that should have brought only despair. Healthcare had taught her that the world contained mysteries that couldn't be solved with instruments or medications, moments when healing happened through channels that medical science couldn't chart. Perhaps this story about the donkey belongs in that same category. Something that couldn't be easily explained, but didn't need to be dismissed because of that limitation at home. Clara makes herself a cup of tea and sits at the kitchen table with Tom's folder spread before her. She picks up the wooden cross, from the counter and holds it while she studies the list of names and phone numbers. Each contact represents another piece of the puzzle, another voice that might help her understand what had really happened to the donkey she'd rescued as a child. She thinks about Walt Morrison, about the injury that had left the donkey limping and unwanted. She thinks about her 7-year-old self, clutching $5 birthday dollars and insisting that the damaged animal deserved a chance. And she thinks about that October afternoon in the woods when something extraordinary had happened that she'd been too young to fully understand. Tomorrow, Clara decides she make her first phone call, not because she expects easy answers, but because some stories are worth pursuing especially when they lead into territory that maps can't chart. The afternoon sun slants through her kitchen window, illuminating the faded photograph that started this journey. The little girl and the donkey gaze back at her across the decades, and Clara realizes that perhaps the most important discoveries aren't the ones that confirm what we already believe, but the ones that expand our understanding of what's possible. The Sunset Manor Care Facility in Cedar Rapids sits among old oak trees, its brick facade softened by careful landscaping and the kind of thoughtful design that prioritizes dignity over mere function. Clara arrives on Thursday morning carrying a small bouquet of flowers from her garden and a manila folder containing copies of Tom Bradley's research. Mrs. Albert Hoffman waits in the sunroom, a woman of 89 whose posture and alert eyes suggest a mind that age hasn't dimmed. Her silver hair is carefully pinned, and she wears a lavender cardigan that brings out the color of her eyes. "Yeah, the young lady asking about the winter donkey," Mrs. Hoffman says, gesturing for Clara to sit in the chair beside hers. Her voice carries the slight German accent that many of her generation retain, softened by decades of American life. "Winter donkey?" Clara asks, settling into the comfortable chair and offering the flowers. "That's what my Albert used to call him," Mrs. Hoffman explains, accepting the bouquet with obvious pleasure, because he only seemed to appear during the hard months, when the snow was deep and the work was heaviest. Mrs. Hoffman's story unfolds with the careful precision of someone who's had years to consider its details. She and her late husband Albert had farmed 240 acres outside of Cedar Rapids from 1954 until 1987, raising corn and soybeans with the help of 2 sturdy draft mules named Jack and Jill. "The first time we saw the donkey was January 1961. She recalls, we'd had a terrible blizzard, 3 feet of snow in 2 days. Albert was trying to get hay out to the cattle in the far pasture, but the tractor was stuck and the mules couldn't pull the load through the drifts by themselves." Clara listens, remembering the harsh Iowa winters of her childhood, when storms could isolate farms for days and livestock required constant attention to survive. Albert was about ready to give up when this donkey appeared at the edge of our property. Mrs. Hoffman continues, "Healthy-looking animal, gray and white with intelligent eyes. It just walked up to our mules and positioned itself alongside them, like it understood what needed to be done. Did it belong to a neighbor?" Mrs. Hoffman shakes her head. "That's what we assumed at first. Albert asked around, but nobody claimed it. And the strange thing was, it seemed to know exactly how to work with Jack and Jill. Most animals need time to adjust to pulling together, but this donkey fit right in, like it had been part of our team for years." Clara opens her folder and shows Mrs. Hoffman the photograph from 1959. Could this be the same animal? The elderly woman studies the image carefully, holding it close to her eyes. The coloring is right, and the size looks about the same. Hard to say for certain after all these years. But yes, I believe it could be. Mrs. Hoffman's account continues with details that make Clara's pulse quicken. The donkey had stayed for 3 days, helping Albert move hay and equipment through the deep snow. It seemed to anticipate what was needed, positioning itself perfectly for maximum pulling power, never balking or resisting the work. On the 4th morning, Albert went out to feed the animals, and the donkey was gone, Mrs. Hoffman says. No tracks leading away, no signs of how it left. Just vanished like it had never been there at all. But that wasn't the end of the story. According to Mrs. Hoffman, the donkey returned 6 more times over the years, always during harsh winters, always staying just long enough to help with the most difficult tasks. The last time was in 1974, she recalls. Albert was 72 by then, and the arthritis in his hands made it hard for him to handle the mules in bad weather. The donkey showed up during an ice storm and worked alongside our animals for nearly a week until the weather cleared and Albert could manage on his own again. Clara takes careful notes, trying to reconcile these accounts with conventional explanations. Mrs. Hoffman, did you ever wonder where the donkey went when it left your farm? Oh, we heard stories, the elderly woman replies with a knowing smile. Coffee shop talk, mostly. Other farmers mentioning a helpful donkey that would appear during emergencies, then disappear. Some folks thought it was wild. Others figured it belonged to someone who let it roam. But Albert and I, we had our own theory. She leans forward conspiratorially. We thought maybe it was one of those animals that just understood its purpose. Like some people are born knowing they're meant to be teachers or doctors, maybe this donkey was born knowing it was meant to help. The words resonate with Clara in ways she hadn't expected. She thinks about her own career in nursing, how even as a child she'd been drawn to caring for injured animals, how the decision to enter healthcare had felt less like a choice than a natural evolution of who she was meant to become. Driving home from Cedar Rapids, Clara's mind churns with questions and possibilities. Mrs. Hoffman's story matches the pattern. Tom Bradley had identified a donkey appearing during emergencies, providing exactly the help that was needed, then vanishing without explanation. But the time frame troubles her. If this was indeed her rescued donkey, it would have been working as a helper for 15 years after disappearing from the Whitman farm. Back in Millbrook, Clara parks in her driveway and sits for a moment before going inside. The rational part of her mind insists that there must be a logical explanation, perhaps multiple donkeys with similar coloring, or stories that have grown in the telling over the decades. But something deeper, the intuition that had guided her through countless medical decisions, tells her that she's uncovering something genuinely extraordinary inside her cottage. Clara spreads her growing collection of documents across the kitchen table. Tom's research, her notes from the interview with Mrs. Hoffman, the original photograph that started this journey. She picks up the wooden cross from the counter and holds it while she reviews what she's learned. The pattern is becoming clear, even if the explanation remains elusive. A rescued donkey, if indeed it was the same animal, hadn't simply disappeared into an ordinary life on some distant farm. Instead, it appears to have spent decades serving as a helper, appearing during emergencies and providing assistance to those who needed it most. Clara thinks about her 7-year-old self, clutching $5 birthday dollars and insisting that the damaged animal deserved a chance. Had she somehow set in motion a chain of events that led to decades of quiet service? The possibility both humbles and disturbs her. She reaches for her phone and dials Tom Bradley's number. When he answers, she can hear the sounds of paper rustling in the background. Tom, I just returned from visiting Mrs. Hoffman, Clara says. Her story is remarkable, but it raises more questions than it answers. I think I need to speak with Dr. Morse next, the veterinarian whose journal entries you mentioned. I was hoping you'd say that, Tom replies. I spoke with him yesterday, and he's agreed to meet with you. Clara, I have to tell you, his records are extraordinary. He documented encounters with what appears to be the same donkey over more than a decade, always during animal medical emergencies. After arranging the meeting for the following day, Clara hangs up and returns to her documents. She studies the photograph again, looking for clues she might have missed. The donkey's eyes seem to hold intelligence that goes beyond normal animal awareness. a sense of purpose that her 7-year-old self had recognized without understanding. As evening settles over Millbrook, Clara prepares a simple dinner and settles into her father's recliner. But instead of her usual evening reading, she finds herself staring out the window at the fields beyond town, wondering if somewhere out there, the donkey she'd rescued is still helping others in ways she's only beginning to understand. The wooden cross warms in her palm as she considers the implications of what she's learning. If these stories are true, if her childhood act of compassion really did save an animal that went on to help others for decades, then perhaps the most important healing doesn't happen in hospitals or clinics, but in the quiet moments when one creature chooses to serve another, asking nothing in return except the opportunity to ease suffering wherever it's found. Dr. Samuel Morse lives in a farmhouse that seems to grow from the Iowa landscape itself, weathered cedar siding the color of autumn wheat, wraparound porch shadowed by massive cottonwood trees. At 83, the retired veterinarian moves, with the careful deliberation of someone whose hands have delivered countless animals into the world, whose eyes have seen both the fragility and resilience of creatures, great and small. Clara finds him in his study, a room lined with veterinary textbooks, medical journals, and what appears to be decades' worth of case notes meticulously organized in filing cabinets. The afternoon sun streams through windows that offer views of pastures where Dr. Morse still keeps a small herd of cattle, more for companionship than commerce. Tom Bradley said you're researching a donkey from the late 1950s, Dr. Morse says, settling into a leather chair worn smooth by decades of use. His voice carries the authority of someone accustomed to making life-and-death decisions, but his manner is gentle. I have to say, when he described your story, it brought back memories I hadn't thought about in years. Clara shows him the photograph, and Dr. Morse studies it with the clinical attention he once brought to examining animals. He reaches for a magnifying glass from his desk drawer, focusing on specific details of the donkey's conformation. The proportions look right, he murmurs. Size, coloring, that particular set to the ears. He looks up at Clara. This could vary. Will be the animal I treated multiple times between 1961 and 1974. Dr. Morse moves to one of his filing cabinets and withdraws a thick folder marked Unusual Cases. Inside are handwritten journal pages, yellowed with age but preserved with obvious care. He spreads several pages across his desk, and Clara can see entries written in the meticulous script of someone trained to document precisely what he observes. I started keeping these special notes early in my practice, Dr. Morse explains. Cases that didn't fit normal patterns, animals that exhibited behavior I couldn't easily categorize. He points to an entry dated March 15th, 1962. This was my first encounter with what I came to think of as the healing donkey. Clara leans forward to read the careful handwriting. Called to the Henderson farm to treat a mare with severe colic. Found unusual donkey gray and white, approximately 12 hands high standing beside the distressed horse. The donkey appeared to be nuzzling the mare's neck and shoulder area. When I examined the horse, her vital signs were more stable than expected given the severity of symptoms reported by Mr. Henderson. The donkey remained close throughout treatment, seemingly monitoring my work. Most unusual behavior for an equine not belonging to the property. You wrote the healing donkey, Clara notes, as if you'd seen it before. By then, I had, Dr. Morse confirms. Word gets around in rural communities when there's an animal that shows up at multiple farms during medical emergencies. Other veterinarians had mentioned it. Farmers talked about it at the co-op. We all started recognizing the signs. He shows Clara entry after entry documenting similar incidents. The donkey appearing at farms when animals were sick or injured, positioning itself near the affected creatures, remaining present throughout treatment, then disappearing once the crisis had passed. The pattern was remarkably consistent. Dr. Morse continues. I'd arrived to treat a sick cow or injured horse, and there would be this donkey, always the same animal, as far as I could tell, standing guard. The sick animals were invariably calmer than I'd expect, their vital signs more stable. Clara studies a particularly detailed entry from 1965, describing the treatment of a prize bull that had suffered a serious leg injury. According to Dr. Morse's notes, the donkey had positioned itself between the injured bull and the other cattle, preventing them from crowding around or causing additional stress. That's not normal animal behavior, Clara observes, her nursing background helping her understand the medical implications. No, it's not. Dr. Morse agrees. Most animals avoid sick or injured members of their group, either from instinct or because illness makes them unpredictable. But this donkey seemed drawn to the drive to the Whitman farm takes Clara through countryside that seems unchanged since her childhood, rolling fields divided by fence lines, old barns weathered to silver gray, farmhouses sheltered by groves of oak and maple trees. She parks beside a mailbox that reads Whitman Acres and walks up a gravel drive toward a house where someone might remember what happened to her donkey all those years ago. Martha Whitman answers the door, a woman in her 70s with kind eyes and work-worn hands. She's the daughter-in-law of the farmer who'd sheltered Clara's donkey in 1959, and she listens patiently as Clara explains her research. "Oh my, you're the little girl who rescued that donkey," Martha says, inviting Clara into a kitchen that smells of fresh bread and coffee. "My late husband Tom used to tell that story. He was so sorry when the animal disappeared, felt responsible, you know?" Martha's account of the donkey's brief stay at their farm adds new details to Clara's growing understanding. The animal had arrived thin and skittish, clearly showing signs of past mistreatment. But under Tom Whitman's gentle care, it had begun to gain weight and confidence. Tom said it was the smartest animal he'd ever worked with, Martha recalls. Seemed to understand everything he said, always knew exactly what was expected. And gentle, you could see it in the way it moved, like it didn't want to cause any creature harm. Clara shows Martha the photograph, and the older woman studies it with obvious recognition. "That's the one, all right. Look at those eyes, intelligent as any person's." Martha pauses, her expression growing thoughtful. "You know, after it disappeared, we heard the strangest stories." "What kind of stories?" Martha refills their coffee cups, clearly organizing her thoughts. "Well, about a month after the donkey vanished, our neighbor Jim Kowalski came by. He was the mail carrier then, covered all the rural routes. Jim mentioned seeing a donkey that looked just like ours helping at the Peterson farm during a difficult calving." Clara leans forward, recognizing another piece of the puzzle she's been assembling. "Then there was the incident at St. Margaret's School," Martha continues. "My youngest daughter attended there, and she came home one day talking about a donkey that had appeared on the playground when one of the children was hurt. The teachers assumed it belonged to a neighboring farm, but when they asked around, nobody claimed it." These accounts match the stories Clara has already collected, but hearing them from Martha Whitman provides crucial confirmation. The donkey hadn't simply wandered away from the farm. It had begun appearing at locations where help was needed, starting within weeks of its disappearance. "Martha, do you have any idea where the donkey might have lived between these appearances?" The older woman shakes her head. "That was always the mystery. Tom and the other farmers would look for it during the times it wasn't helping somewhere, but nobody ever found where it sheltered. It was like it just existed when people needed it, then faded away until the next emergency." After leaving the Whitman farm, Clara drives to the abandoned Peterson property that Martha had mentioned. The farmhouse stands empty now, windows boarded and yard overgrown with weeds. But in the barn, she finds evidence of the story Martha had shared, old veterinary records left behind when the family moved away, including a detailed account of the difficult calving that had required outside help. The veterinary report, dated September 1959, describes how a cow in breech labor had been assisted by a donkey of unknown ownership that appeared to calm both the cow and her newborn calf. The attending veterinarian had noted the unusual nature of the situation, writing, "Have never observed such purposeful behavior from an unrelated animal." The donkey seemed to understand exactly what was needed and positioned itself to provide maximum comfort to the distressed cow. Clara carefully photographs the document, adding it to her growing collection of evidence. Each new piece of the puzzle confirms what she's beginning to understand, that her rescued donkey had somehow dedicated its life to helping others, appearing wherever healing was needed most, driving back toward Millbrook as afternoon shadows lengthen. Clara finds herself thinking about her nursing career with new perspective. She remembers the night shifts when she'd felt drawn to certain patients' rooms, somehow knowing that her presence was needed even before alarms sounded. She thinks about the families she'd comforted during the worst moments of their lives, offering nothing more than her presence and attention. Perhaps Clara realizes the donkey had taught her more than she'd understood at the time. Her childhood act of compassion had saved an animal that went on to demonstrate the healing power of simply being present with those who suffer. And maybe, without fully understanding why, Clara had spent her career following that same calling. At home, she finds a message on her answering machine from Tom Bradley. His voice carries unusual excitement as he explains that he's discovered something significant in the county archives, documents that might finally explain what happened to the donkey in its final years. Clara calls him back immediately, and Tom's enthusiasm is unmistakable. "Clara, I found records from the regional hospital, the one in Cedar Rapids. It seems they had an unusual therapy animal program in the early 1970s, and I think your donkey might have been part of it." He pauses dramatically. "Can you meet me at the Historical Society tomorrow morning? I want to show you what I've discovered before we jump to any conclusions." That evening, Clara sits at her kitchen table with all her research spread before her. The evidence now spans 15 years and includes testimonies from farmers, veterinarians, teachers, and others who'd witnessed the donkey's remarkable behavior. The pattern is consistent and well documented. An animal that appeared during emergencies, provided comfort and healing, then disappeared until needed again. She picks up the wooden cross from the counter, rolling it between her palms as she'd done so many times during difficult nights at the hospital. The smooth wood warms under her touch, and Clara feels a deep sense of connection to something larger than herself, the same feeling she'd experienced during her most meaningful moments. As a nurse, the photograph lies before her, the 7-year-old girl and the rescued donkey frozen in time. But Clara now understands that what the picture captures isn't just a moment of childhood compassion. It's the beginning of a story about service and healing that continued for decades, touching lives in ways she's only beginning to comprehend. Tomorrow, she'll learn what Tom has discovered about the donkey's final years. But tonight, Clara allows herself to feel proud of her 7-year-old self, the little girl who'd recognized something special in a damaged animal and refused to let it be discarded. That act of compassion had rippled through decades, creating a legacy of healing that Clara is only now beginning to understand. Outside her window, the first stars appear in the darkening sky. Somewhere in those shadows, Clara thinks the donkey she'd rescued might still be resting, its mission of healing finally complete. The thought brings her a peace she hasn't felt since retirement, the satisfaction of knowing that her life's work, the calling to heal and comfort others, had begun with $5 birthday and a child's insistence that every creature deserves compassion. Clara arrives at the Historical Society early the next morning to find Tom Bradley already deep in conversation with a woman she doesn't recognize. The stranger appears to be in her 60s, with silver hair pulled back in a practical bun and the kind of direct gaze that suggests someone accustomed to responsibility. "Clara, I'd like you to meet Eleanor Patterson," Tom says as she approaches. She was the volunteer coordinator at Cedar Rapids Regional Hospital from 1970 to 1985. When I described your research to her yesterday, she insisted on driving down to meet you. Eleanor extends her hand with a firm grip. "I've been waiting 15 years for someone to ask the right questions about our therapy donkey," she says. When Tom described your story, I knew we were finally going to piece together the complete picture. They moved to Tom's workspace, where Eleanor has spread a collection of documents across the table: hospital records, volunteer schedules, and what appears to be a thick personnel file marked Therapy Animals Program. The program started in 1971, Eleanor explains, settling into a chair. It was controversial at the time. Most hospitals didn't allow animals of any kind on the premises. But Dr. Margaret Simmons, our chief of pediatrics, had read research about the healing benefits of animal interaction. She convinced the administration to try a pilot program. Clara leans forward, sensing that she's about to learn something crucial about the donkey's final chapter. "We started with cats and small dogs," Eleanor continues, "but they proved difficult to manage in a hospital environment. Then, one day in March 1972, this donkey simply appeared in our parking lot. Security called animal control, but before they could arrive, something extraordinary happened." Eleanor opens the personnel file and withdraws a memorandum dated March 15, 1972. The document, written by Dr. Simmons, describes how the donkey had somehow made its way into the pediatric ward, where it positioned itself beside the bed of a terminally ill child who'd been unresponsive for days. When the staff found the donkey, the little boy was awake for the first time in a week, Eleanor recalls. He was petting the animal and speaking softly to it. Dr. Simmons decided not to have it removed immediately. She wanted to observe what would happen. Clara studies the memorandum, recognizing the careful language of medical documentation. But between the clinical phrases, she can read the amazement of professionals witnessing something they couldn't easily explain. What happened next? Clara asks. "The boy continued to improve as long as the donkey was present," Eleanor replies. "His pain seemed more manageable, his appetite returned, and he began interacting with staff and family members again. When we finally tried to remove the donkey after 3 days, the child's condition immediately worsened." Eleanor shows Clara a series of progress notes documenting the unusual situation. The attending physicians had been forced to choose between hospital regulations and a patient's well-being. They chose the patient. Dr. Simmons convinced the administration to make an exception, Eleanor explains. The donkey was officially registered as a therapy animal, the first of its kind in any Iowa hospital. We gave it a name badge and everything. Gabriel, therapy volunteer. The name sends a chill through Clara. Gabriel, the messenger, the herald of important news. Whether the hospital staff had chosen the name intuitionally or by coincidence, it seemed remarkably appropriate for an animal whose life had been dedicated to appearing wherever healing was needed. Gabriel became a regular presence in the pediatric ward, Eleanor continues. We never knew how he determined which patients needed him most, but his instincts were flawless. He'd spend hours beside children who were frightened or in pain, somehow communicating a sense of peace that medication couldn't provide. Clara reviews page after page of documentation. The hospital had meticulously recorded Gabriel's interactions with patients, noting improved outcomes that consistently exceeded medical expectations. Children who'd been withdrawn and fearful became more cooperative with treatment. Families found comfort during the most difficult moments of their children's illnesses. Eleanor, how long did Gabriel work at the hospital? Until December 1975, Eleanor replies quietly. He was with us for nearly 4 years. But in his final months, we could see that age was taking its toll. He moved more slowly, needed more rest between patient visits. The veterinarian who examined him estimated he was at least 20 years old ancient for a working donkey. Eleanor opens a different folder and withdraws what appears to be Gabriel's final medical examination report. The document describes an animal showing clear signs of advanced age, but maintaining remarkable gentleness and intelligence despite physical deterioration. His last patient was a 7-year-old girl named Susan Chun, Eleanor says. She'd been in a car accident and was recovering from multiple surgeries. Susan was having nightmares, refusing to cooperate with physical therapy. Then Gabriel appeared at her bedside one morning, and everything changed. Clara recognizes the name Susan Chun from her conversation with Sister Mary Catherine at the convent. This was the same child who'd suffered the allergic reaction on the school playground years earlier, when the donkey had appeared to comfort her during the emergency. Gabriel stayed with Susan for 2 weeks, Eleanor continues. He seemed to understand that she needed extra time to heal, both physically and emotionally. When she was finally ready for discharge, Gabriel walked her to the elevator, then returned to his usual spot in the therapy room. And that was the last time he was seen? Eleanor nods. The next morning, we found the therapy room empty. No sign of how Gabriel had left. The doors were locked, the windows too high for an animal to reach. He simply vanished, just like that. Clara feels the weight of this revelation. Gabriel's disappearance from the hospital marked the end of a 16-year mission that had begun when a 7-year-old girl spent her birthday money to save an unwanted donkey. From the county fair in 1959 to the hospital corridors in 1975, the same animal had dedicated its life to healing others. Eleanor, do you have any idea what happened to Gabriel after he left the hospital? The older woman shakes her head sadly. We searched everywhere, contacted every animal shelter and farm in the region. It was as if he'd simply chosen his moment to say goodbye and departed on his own terms. As Clara drives home that afternoon, she carries with her the weight of Gabriel's complete story. The donkey she'd rescued as a child had spent its entire adult life serving others, helping farmers during emergencies, comforting children in schools and hospitals, appearing wherever healing was most needed. But questions remain that Clara knows she must pursue. If Gabriel had indeed lived until 1975, and if he was already mature when she rescued him in 1959, then he would have been remarkably old for a donkey. Most donkeys live only 15 to 20 years, yet Gabriel had apparently served for 16 years after his rescue, suggesting a lifespan that exceeded normal expectations. At home, Clara sits with her growing collection of evidence and the wooden cross that has become her touchstone throughout this journey. She thinks about her nursing career, about the countless nights she'd provided comfort to patients and families during their darkest hours. Now, she understands that her calling to heal might have been inspired by witnessing Gabriel's example. As a child, even if she hadn't fully understood it at the time, the photograph lies before her of a 7-year-old girl and a rescued donkey, beginning a story that would span decades and touch countless lives. Clara realizes that she's been piecing together more than just a history of an unusual animal. She's been discovering the origins of her own purpose, the source of the compassion that guided her through a lifetime of service to others. Tom Bradley's call comes at 7 in the morning, his voice tight with excitement and something that sounds like disbelief. Clara, you need to come to the Historical Society immediately. I found something in the county records that changes everything we thought we knew about your story. Clara dresses quickly, her mind racing with possibilities. Over the past weeks, each new discovery has added another layer to Gabriel's remarkable story. But Tom's tone suggests this revelation will be different, more fundamental, more disturbing. She finds him in the basement archives of the Historical Society, surrounded by boxes of documents that appear to date back decades. His face is pale, and his usually steady hand shakes slightly as he handles a manila folder marked adoption records, sealed. Clara, I need to ask you something personal before I show you what I found, Tom says. How much do you know about your adoption? About your biological family? The question catches Clara off guard. Very little. Harold and Ruth Jennings adopted me when I was 3 years old. They always said my biological parents had died in an accident and that there were no other relatives able to care for me. Tom's expression grows grave. Clara, I'm afraid that's not the complete truth. He opens the folder and withdraws what appears to be an official birth certificate, yellowed with age. Your biological grandfather was Walter Morrison, the same Walt Morrison who sold the donkey to you at the county fair. Clara stares at the document, her mind struggling to process this revelation. The man who'd abused Gabriel, who'd neglected and mistreated the donkey before bringing it to the fair, that man had been her grandfather. How is that possible? She whispers. Tom carefully spreads additional documents across the table: adoption papers, court records, and what appears to be a Child Protective Services report from 1952. The story they tell is heartbreaking and complex. Clara's biological mother, Morrison's daughter, had been a victim of domestic violence who died when Clara was just 2 years old. Clara's father had abandoned the family months earlier, leaving Clara in the care of her abusive grandfather. The adoption had been arranged by the county to remove Clara from a dangerous situation. The social worker's report describes conditions in Morrison's household that were disturbing, Tom says gently. Neglect of both animals and the child in his care. Your adoptive parents were told you were an orphan because the authorities felt a complete break from your past would be in your best interest. Clara's hands tremble as she reads the social worker's careful documentation of the neglect and abuse she'd endured during her first years of life. The one detail stands out that makes her pulse quicken. The report mentions that young Clara had formed an attachment to a donkey on her grandfather's property, and that separating them had caused significant distress. Tom, this means Gabriel and I knew each other before the county fair, Clara says slowly. He wasn't just any donkey I happened to rescue. He was my companion during the worst period of my childhood. The implications cascade through Clara's mind like dominoes falling. Gabriel hadn't disappeared from the Whitman farm and begun a random mission of healing. He'd somehow recognized Clara at the county fair, had allowed himself to be rescued by the child he'd once comforted, and had then spent his life serving others in the way he'd once served her. Tom shows her one final document: Morrison's death certificate from 1960. Clara, there's something else you need to know. The circumstances of your grandfather's death. They weren't entirely accidental. According to the sheriff's report, Morrison had been found in a field near the Whitman farm, apparently kicked by a large animal. But witnesses reported seeing him earlier that evening attempting to recapture a donkey that had escaped from his property years earlier. The investigation concluded that Morrison was trying to retrieve Gabriel when the animal defended itself, Tom explains. Given Morrison's history of animal abuse, the authorities ruled it justifiable self-defense, even though the defender was an animal. Clara sits in stunned silence, processing the complete picture of her relationship with Gabriel. The donkey hadn't just been her childhood rescue, he'd been her protector during the most vulnerable period of her life. When she'd saved him at the county fair, he'd actually been allowing her to complete a circle of healing that had begun years earlier. Clara, there's one more thing, Tom says softly. He shows her a faded photograph tucked inside the adoption file, a picture of a very young Clara sitting beside a donkey in what appears to be a farmyard. The image is grainy and damaged, but the resemblance to her county fair photograph is unmistakable. This was taken by the social worker during her initial investigation, Tom explains. She noted that the child showed remarkable attachment to the animal, and that the donkey appeared to be the only source of comfort in an otherwise traumatic situation. Looking at the photograph, Clara can see that Gabriel is younger in this image, his coat fuller, his posture more alert. But his eyes, those intelligent, compassionate eyes, are exactly the same as she remembers from the county fair. Tom, this means Gabriel spent his early years protecting me from my grandfather's abuse. Then, when the county separated us, he somehow found a way to reconnect with me years later at the fair. And after you rescued him, he spent the rest of his life doing for others what he'd once done for you, providing comfort and healing to those who needed it most. Tom closes the folders carefully. Clara, I think you need to understand that your grandfather's death wasn't just an accident. Gabriel was protecting other potential victims from the man who'd abused both of you. The weight of this revelation settles over Clara like a heavy blanket. Her entire understanding of her relationship with Gabriel has been transformed. What she'd remembered as a simple act of childhood compassion now reveals itself as part of a much deeper story about survival, protection, and the bonds that can form between a vulnerable child and an animal who refuses to abandon him. Clara thinks about her nursing career with new perspective. Her calling to heal others hadn't just been inspired by Gabriel's example. It had been rooted in her earliest experiences of receiving comfort from him during the darkest period of her childhood. Every patient she'd comforted, every family she'd supported during crisis, had been an extension of the healing she'd first received from Gabriel's presence. Tom, I need to process all of this, Clara says finally. But I think I understand now why Gabriel's story has felt so important to me. It wasn't just about documenting the life of an unusual animal. It was about understanding the foundations of my own purpose. As Clara drives home through the familiar countryside, she carries with her a completely transformed understanding of her life's journey. The little girl in the photograph hadn't rescued a random donkey. She'd reconnected with her earliest protector, completing a circle of healing that had begun when she was too young to remember. Gabriel had spent his life serving others, because that's what he'd always done first for a vulnerable child named Clara, then for countless others who needed comfort and healing. And Clara had spent her career doing the same, following a path that Gabriel had shown her before she was old enough to understand where it would lead. The photograph that started this journey now reveals new layers of meaning. It captures not just a moment of rescue, but a reunion, a child and her protector finding each other again and setting in motion a lifetime dedicated to healing others. The story Clara thought she was discovering about Gabriel was actually the story of her own origins, the source of the compassion that had guided her through decades of service to others. Clara spends 3 days in careful reflection before making her decision. The revelation about her connection to Gabriel has transformed her understanding of everything: her childhood, her career choice, her purpose. Now she faces a choice that will determine how this story ends. Keep these discoveries private, or share them with the community that Gabriel served for so many years. The decision comes to her during a quiet evening on her front porch, watching the sun set over the cornfields. She thinks about Gabriel's life of service, how he'd appeared whenever healing was needed, never seeking recognition or reward. His story deserves to be told, Clara realizes, not as a curiosity or oddity, but as an example of what it means to dedicate one's life to serving others. She calls Tom Bradley first, then Eleanor Patterson, and finally her niece Sarah. To each, she explains her decision to organize a community gathering where Gabriel's complete story can be shared. The response is immediately supportive. Tom offers the Historical Society as a venue. Eleanor volunteers to contact families whose children had been helped by Gabriel at the hospital. And Sarah surprises Clara by offering to drive down from Minneapolis to attend. "Aunt Clara, I've been thinking about our conversations," Sarah says during their longest phone call in years. "Mom always said you had a special gift for healing, that people just naturally felt better when you were around. If this donkey really influenced your life the way you think it did, then his story is part of our family history too." The community response exceeds Clara's expectations. Word spreads through the informal networks that connect small Iowa towns. Coffee shop conversations, church announcements, casual encounters at the grocery store. Within a week, Clara has received calls from people as far away as Cedar Rapids, saying they plan to attend because they, too, have stories about an unusual donkey who'd appeared during difficult times. Mrs. Hoffman's daughter calls to say her mother insists on making the trip from her care facility. Dr. Morse, despite his age, confirms he'll be there with his veterinary records. Sister Mary Catherine requests permission to bring several of her fellow nuns, explaining that the convent community has been discussing Gabriel's story since Clara's visit, but it's the call from Susan Chun that moves Clara most deeply. Now in her 60s and living in Iowa City, Susan explains that she's never forgotten the donkey who'd comforted her during two of the most frightening experiences of her childhood: the allergic reaction at school and her hospitalization after the car accident. "I spent my career as a pediatric nurse," Susan tells Clara. "I always credited my recovery experiences for inspiring that choice, but I never understood the connection until now. That donkey Gabriel, he showed me what healing really looks like. It's not just medical treatment. It's the presence of someone who cares." As the gathering approaches, Clara finds herself grappling with the weight of what she's about to share. The story she'll tell will reveal her own painful origins, her grandfather's abuse, and the extraordinary animal who'd protected her before dedicating his life to helping others. It's a story about trauma and healing, about the bonds that form between vulnerable beings, and about how acts of compassion can ripple through decades. She spends hours preparing her presentation, organizing the evidence she's collected: photographs, veterinary records, hospital documentation, and testimonies from dozens of witnesses. Each piece of the puzzle contributes to a portrait of an animal whose life had been dedicated to service, whose story intersects with her own in ways she's only now beginning to understand. The night before the gathering, Clara sits at her kitchen table with everything arranged before her. The original photograph, herself at 7, kneeling beside Gabriel with 5 crumpled dollars, occupies the center of the display. Surrounding it are the documents that tell the rest of the story: Gabriel's years of service, his healing presence at farms and schools and hospitals, and finally, the revelation about their shared past. She picks up the wooden cross that's been her companion throughout this journey, rolling it between her palms as she'd done so many times during difficult nights at the hospital. The smooth wood warms under her touch, and Clara feels a deep sense of preparation, as if her entire life has been leading to this moment of sharing Gabriel's story. Sarah arrives that evening, driving down from Minneapolis with her teenage daughter, Emma, Clara's great niece, who she's meeting for the first time. The reunion is emotional but comfortable, the kind of family reconnection that feels overdue and perfectly timed. Emma's been studying for a project about family history, Sarah explains as they sit in Clara's living room. "When I told her about Gabriel's story and your research, she asked if she could include it in her presentation. She wants to understand where the healing tradition in our family comes from." Anna, a thoughtful 16-year-old with her great-aunts, observant eyes, studies the evidence Clara has assembled. "Aunt Clara, this is like discovering that our family has a guardian angel." Clara holds up the original photograph, the image that started her journey of discovery. The room leans forward collectively as she describes that summer day in 1959 when a 7-year-old girl spent her birthday money to save an unwanted donkey. "What? I didn't understand then," Clara continues. "Was that Gabriel and I already knew each other? During the first 3 years of my life, when I lived with my abusive grandfather, Walt Morrison, Gabriel was my protector and companion. When the county removed me from that dangerous situation, Gabriel and I were separated. But somehow, 4 years later, he found me again at the county fair." A murmur ripples through the audience as people begin to understand the deeper significance of what they're hearing. This isn't just a story about animal rescue. It's about the bonds that form between vulnerable beings and the ways those connections can endure across time and circumstance. Clara shows the social worker's photograph from her childhood. The grainy image of a very young Clara sitting beside Gabriel in Morrison's farmyard. The resemblance to the county fair photograph is unmistakable, and several people in the audience gasp audibly at the visual evidence of their long relationship. Gabriel didn't disappear from the Whitman farm by accident, Clara explains. He began a mission that would continue for 16 years, appearing wherever healing was needed most, providing comfort to animals and people in distress, then vanishing until the next emergency arose. She calls upon the witnesses who've traveled to share their stories. Mrs. Hoffman, despite her age, speaks clearly about the winter donkey who'd appeared during blizzards to help with the heaviest work. Her account is corroborated by other farmers in attendance, who nod in recognition as she describes Gabriel's uncanny ability to know exactly what was needed. Dr. Morse presents his veterinary records with the precision of a scientist documenting extraordinary phenomena. He reads selected passages from his journal entries, describing Gabriel's behavior during animal medical emergencies. The clinical language can't hide his amazement at what he'd witnessed over more than a decade of encounters. This animal exhibited intelligence and empathy that exceeded anything in my 40 years of veterinary practice, Dr. Morse tells the gathered crowd. He seemed to understand not just what animals needed physically, but what they needed emotionally to begin healing. Sister Mary Catherine's testimony about Gabriel's appearances on the school playground adds another dimension to the story. Her account of the donkey comforting upset children, particularly during the incident with Susan Chun's allergic reaction, demonstrates the breadth of Gabriel's mission. But it's Susan Chun's own testimony that brings many in the audience to tears. Now a respected pediatric nurse herself, Susan describes how Gabriel's presence during two frightening childhood experiences had shaped her understanding of what healing really means. Gabriel taught me that medical care isn't just about procedures and medications, Susan says, her voice steady despite the emotion in her eyes. It's about the presence of someone who cares, someone who stays with you during the frightening moments and helps you feel less alone. Eleanor Patterson presents the hospital records documenting Gabriel's 3 years as an official therapy animal. She describes how he'd somehow known which children needed him most, spending hours beside their beds during the darkest periods of their illnesses. We never understood how Gabriel made those decisions, Eleanor explains. But his instincts were flawless. Children who'd been withdrawn and fearful would begin to respond when Gabriel was present. Families found comfort during the most difficult moments of their children's medical journeys. As each witness shares their account, a pattern emerges that goes beyond mere coincidence. Gabriel hadn't just been an unusually helpful animal. He'd been conducting a systematic mission of healing that spanned 3 counties and 16 years, touching hundreds of lives along the way. Clara shows the audience a map Tom Bradley has prepared, marking every location where Gabriel had been sighted. The red dots create a web across the rural landscape, connecting farms, schools, the hospital, and countless other places where healing had been needed. This map represents more than Gabriel's physical journey, Clara explains. It represents the geography of compassion, all the places where one animal's dedication to service created ripples of healing that continue to this day. The moment has come for the revelation that will transform how everyone understands the story. Clara takes a deep breath and shows the death certificate for Walt Morrison, explaining how her grandfather had died while attempting to recapture Gabriel in 1960. Gabriel protected me as a child from the man who abused both of us, Clara says quietly. And when that man tried to reclaim him, Gabriel defended himself and ended a cycle of violence that might have continued to harm others. The room is completely silent as people process this information. They're beginning to understand that Gabriel's story isn't just about healing. It's about justice, protection, and the courage to stand against those who cause harm. Clara looks out at the faces before her, seeing recognition and wonder in equal measure. These people have come to hear about an unusual donkey, but they're discovering something far more profound, a story about how love and compassion can overcome trauma, how acts of protection can ripple through generations, and how healing happens through the simple presence of those who refuse to abandon us during our darkest moments. Clara pauses, letting the weight of Gabriel's complete story settle over the gathered community. She can see the impact in their faces. Some are crying openly, others sit in stunned silence, and many nod with the recognition that comes from finally understanding something they'd sensed but never fully grasped. Gabriel's mission didn't end when he disappeared from the hospital in 1975. Clara continues, her voice growing stronger with conviction. It continues through every person in this room who was touched by his presence, and through every act of compassion those people have performed since then. She gestures towards Susan Chun, who sits in the front row with tears streaming down her cheeks. Susan became a pediatric nurse because Gabriel showed her what healing looks like. How many children has she comforted during her career? How many families has she supported during their darkest hours? Susan stands and addresses the crowd, her voice trembling but clear. Hundreds, she says simply. And I tried to be present for them the way Gabriel was present for me, not just as a medical professional, but as someone who genuinely cared about their suffering. Clara points to Dr. Morse, whose veterinary records have documented so much of Gabriel's work. Dr. Morse changed his practice after encountering Gabriel. He began incorporating animal therapy into his treatment recommendations, understanding that healing often requires more than medical intervention. The elderly veterinarian nods, his voice carrying the weight of decades of experience. Gabriel taught me that the best medicine is often simply being present with those who suffer. I carried that lesson with me through 40 years of practice. One by one, others in the audience begin to stand and share their own stories. A former teacher explains how witnessing Gabriel comfort children on the playground had influenced her approach to education, making her more attentive to students who were struggling emotionally. A farmer describes how Gabriel's example had inspired him to volunteer with a local animal rescue organization. This is Gabriel's true legacy, Clara says as the testimonies continue. Not just the individual lives he touched, but the ripple effect of compassion that spread from those encounters. Each person he helped went on to help others, creating an ever-widening circle of healing that continues to this day. Tom Bradley approaches the front of the room carrying a large wrapped package. Clara, the Historical Society would like to present you with something that we hope will honor Gabriel's memory and inspire future generations. He unwraps a bronze plaque that reads, "In memory of Gabriel, 1955 to 1975, a donkey whose life was dedicated to healing others." His story reminds us that compassion knows no boundaries, that healing comes in many forms, and that the smallest acts of kindness can echo through eternity. Clara accepts the plaque with hands that tremble slightly, overwhelmed by the community's response to Gabriel's story. But she knows the day's significance extends beyond memorializing one remarkable animal. I propose that we establish an annual Gabriel Day, Clara announces, the idea forming as she speaks. A day when our community commits to acts of kindness and service, when we remember that healing happens not through grand gestures, but through the daily choice to be present with those who need us. The response is immediate and enthusiastic. People begin volunteering to organize the event, to contact local schools and churches, to reach out to neighboring communities. What began as Clara's personal quest to understand her past has transformed into a community commitment to carry Gabriel's mission forward. Eleanor Patterson stands and addresses the crowd. The hospital where Gabriel served has agreed to establish a therapy animal program in his honor. We want to ensure that future generations of sick children can experience the same healing presence that Gabriel provided. The room erupts in applause, but Clara raises her hand for attention. There's one more element to Gabriel's legacy that needs to be established. I want to create a time capsule, Clara announces. A collection of all the artifacts and stories we've gathered, sealed and buried where Gabriel is laid to rest. Future generations should know this story, should understand that extraordinary healing can come from the most unexpected sources. Sarah stands from her seat, her daughter Emma beside her. The family would like to contribute to that time capsule. Sarah says, "We want future generations to understand how Gabriel influenced our family's tradition of service to others." Emma, showing the confidence of her generation, adds, "I want to include a letter explaining how Gabriel's story has inspired me to consider a career in veterinary medicine. His example shows that healing is about more than just treating symptoms. It's about caring for the whole being." As the gathering concludes, people don't rush to leave. Instead, they cluster in small groups, continuing to share stories and make plans for honoring Gabriel's legacy. Children who had been comforted by Gabriel are now making arrangements to volunteer together. Families are discussing how they can incorporate Gabriel's example of service into their own lives. Clara stands at the front of the room, still holding the bronze plaque, watching as a community transforms its understanding of what's possible when one being dedicates their life to serving others. Gabriel's story has become more than history. It's become a call to action, an invitation for everyone present to consider how they might carry forward his mission of healing. 6 months after the community gathering, Clara stands in the town square of Millbrook beside a bronze statue that captures Gabriel in a moment of gentle attention, head lowered, ears forward, eyes kind and alert. The memorial has become a pilgrimage site of sorts, drawing visitors from across Iowa and beyond who've heard the story of the donkey who dedicated his life to healing others. The Gentle Souls program that Clara established has grown beyond her wildest expectations. What began as a small effort to rescue abandoned animals has evolved into a comprehensive network connecting therapy animals with hospitals, schools, and care facilities throughout the region. The program's headquarters occupies a renovated barn on the edge of town, where a dozen rescued animals await training for their healing missions. Sarah and Emma have become regular fixtures in Millbrook, driving down from Minneapolis every few weeks to help with the program. Emma, now a high school senior, has been accepted to veterinary school and speaks passionately about carrying forward Gabriel's example in her chosen profession. "Gabriel taught us that healing isn't just about fixing what's broken," Emma tells the volunteers who gather each weekend to work with the animals. "It's about being present with those who suffer, about offering companionship when people feel most alone." The time capsule ceremony had taken place on a crisp October morning, exactly 67 years after Gabriel first rescued Clara from the woods behind her elementary school. The entire community had gathered in the cemetery where a small marker indicates Gabriel's final resting place, determined by the spot where his collar and harness had been found in 1976. A year after his disappearance from the hospital, Clara had carefully placed each artifact into the sealed container. The original photograph that started her quest, Dr. Morse's veterinary journals, Eleanor's hospital records, drawings from children who'd been comforted by Gabriel, and letters from dozens of people whose lives had been touched by his presence. The time capsule also contains copies of the bronze plaque and documentation of the Gentle Souls program, evidence that Gabriel's mission continues through new generations of healing animals. But perhaps the most precious item in the collection is a letter Clara wrote to future generations, explaining what Gabriel's story had taught her about the nature of compassion and service. "Healing," Clara had written, "doesn't require grand gestures or extraordinary abilities. It requires only the willingness to be present with those who need us, to offer comfort without expecting anything in return, and to trust that small acts of kindness can echo through eternity. The annual Gabriel Day has become a community institution, marked not by festivities, but by service. Schools organize visits to care facilities, families volunteer at animal shelters, and neighbors check on those who might be lonely or struggling. The day serves as a reminder that Gabriel's mission, appearing wherever healing is needed, can be carried forward by anyone willing to pay attention to the suffering around them. Clara's own transformation has been as remarkable as any element of Gabriel's story. The lonely widow who'd found a faded photograph 6 months ago has become the heart of a community dedicated to service. Her cottage, once a refuge from the world, now serves as an informal headquarters for the various programs that have emerged. From Gabriel's legacy on quiet evenings, Clara sits on her front porch with the wooden cross in her palm, watching the sunset paint the Iowa sky in shades of gold and amber. The cross has become more than a memento from her nursing career. It's a symbol of the sacred calling that Gabriel first showed her as a frightened child, and that she carried forward through decades of caring for others. Visitors come regularly to hear Gabriel's story, drawn by word of mouth and occasional newspaper articles about the unusual memorial in Millbrook's town square. Clara has become the keeper of Gabriel's memory, sharing his story with anyone willing to listen. She speaks at schools and community centers, explaining how one animal's dedication to service had rippled through generations. The children are her favorite audiences. They understand intuitively what adults sometimes struggle to accept, that love and compassion can transcend normal boundaries, that healing can come from unexpected sources, and that every act of kindness matters more than we know. Gabriel wasn't magical, Clara tells them. He was simply willing to serve others, to appear wherever healing was needed, to stay with those who were frightened or hurt until they felt safe again. And every one of you can do the same thing. The physical evidence of Gabriel's impact surrounds Clara daily. The bronze statue draws a steady stream of visitors who leave flowers and notes of gratitude. The Gentle Souls program continues to grow, placing therapy animals in new locations every month. Children who participate in Gabriel Day carry his example into their own futures, becoming teachers and nurses and veterinarians, inspired by a donkey who showed them what dedication to others looks like. But the deepest transformation has been in Clara herself. The woman who'd returned to Millbrook seeking quiet retirement has discovered instead a renewed sense of purpose. Gabriel's story has become her story, their shared journey from trauma to healing, providing a template for others seeking to understand how broken hearts can be mended and how those who've been healed can become healers themselves. As autumn settles over Iowa once again, Clara reflects on the journey that began with a simple photograph and led to the recovery of her life's deepest meaning. She thinks about 7-year-old Clara, clutching $5 birthday and insisting that an injured donkey deserved a chance. That little girl couldn't have imagined that her act of compassion would set in motion a mission of healing that would span decades and touch countless lives. The photograph still sits on Clara's kitchen table, but it's no longer a relic of the past. It's become a promise for the future, evidence that love and compassion can overcome trauma, that healing is always possible, and that the smallest acts of kindness can echo through eternity, touching lives in ways we never imagine. Gabriel's mission continues through Clara, through the Gentle Souls program, through every person who's chosen to carry forward his example of serving others. The donkey who dedicated his life to healing has become immortal through the compassion he inspired, proving that love, once given freely, can never truly die.